We're going to continue our study on Genesis 34, the story of Dinah or Dinah. And I want us to take a moment to place her story within this larger narrative arc. This is important because our stories don't happen in a vacuum. The story didn't start when you showed up, and it won't end when you leave. And so many of the circumstances of our lives took place before we were even born. This is most certainly the case with Dinah, because Dinah is a descendant of Abraham. And you know that in Genesis chapter 12, God makes a promise to Abraham. God makes a call and a promise, or we could say God calls Abraham to a promise. God tells Abraham he's going to have descendants and land and blessing. God makes a promise to Abram that he is going to have descendants, and Abram has a barren wife. And that simple dynamic means that the stories of the ancestors tell us the stories of a people who are obsessed with descendants and fertility. I would go further and say that the barrenness of Abram's wife shapes the way they understand or interact with God's promise. Abram ends up with two wives, Sarah and Hagar, two wives and two sons. The first wife, Sarah, has his second-born son, Isaac. His second wife, the Egyptian Hagar, has his firstborn, Ishmael. Two sons, and the promise doesn't come to the firstborn, but to the second-born. Isaac then has one wife and two sons, Jacob and Esau. And again, we see a struggle here around which child will carry the promise. And again, it's the second-born, Jacob. Jacob knows what it is to grow up in a family where he is not the favorite, and yet somehow he is unable to break the cycle in his own family. Jacob has four wives: Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah, 12 sons and 1 daughter. And the story of Jacob and his family is characterized by rivalry and favoritism throughout. In fact, of Jacob's 12 sons, his favorite is the next to the youngest, Joseph. And Joseph's favoritism is evident because Jacob gave him a special coat. This story continues to perpetuate the drama of rivalry when the brothers kidnap and sell their brother into slavery. And they take Jacob's favorite son, Joseph's coat, and they dip it in blood and take it back to their father and try to deceive him into believing that his favorite son, Joseph, is dead. And in response to this, the Bible says this: Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on. He put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. The imagery of Jacob's grief is so great that he cannot be comforted by his other children. And here we see the language, all his sons and all his daughters. Now we know that Jacob had other sons, but to our knowledge, he only had one daughter, and this is Dinah. Genesis chapters 29 to 30 tell us the story of the births of Jacob's children, with Leah, his first wife, Rachel, his second wife, Zilpah, the slave of Leah, and Bilhah, the slave of Rachel. And the whole story is set up within the context of rivalry. Leah bears Jacob's sons each time, hoping that she will win her husband's love and favor. Rachel, the beloved, experiences the anguish of her infertility and resorts to giving Jacob her slave girl, Bilhah, who bears sons on her behalf. But then Leah, not to be outdone, offers Jacob her slave girl, who also bears sons for Jacob. And finally, Rachel has a son, whom she promptly names Joseph, meaning, "May God give me another son." Once again conveying the values that she and her sister have taken on in their quest to win within this system. Please note that the context that tells women that their value is tied to their ability to bear sons makes them complicit in the oppression of each other, their slaves, and themselves. The baby race is just about over at the end of chapter 30. Leah is the mother of 6 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and 1 daughter, Dinah. And also included in her tally are Zilpah's sons, Gad and Asher, for a total of 8. Rachel claims as her children the 2 sons of her slave, Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali. And then she gives birth to Joseph, and later on dies in childbirth when Ben-Oni, later named Benjamin, is born. So according to the text, all the tally, Jacob has 12 sons and 1 daughter. So what are we to make of the reference, all his sons and all his daughters, later on? So let me give you a couple of options. Option 1 is that we respond to the text as a historical document, in which case we consider what is most likely, what is most possible based on the known world. And that is that the reference to all of his sons and daughters might be talking about his daughters-in-law. So we find this solution in many Old Testament commentaries. That is a very viable and reasonable option. When it says daughters, it means Dinah and his daughters-in-law. Option 2 is to acknowledge that this is a literary document and that there's something that's poetic about this passage, so that the phrase all of his sons and all of his daughters is a figure of speech. It's a poetic way of saying all of the children that would be shaped by parallelism and not gender, so that if I say all of his sons, then I must say all of his daughters to incorporate all of the children. That option is nice because it could also make reference to the children and the descendants that they represent. But then there's another option, and that option is intersectional and womanist, one that takes into account the social context and its complexities, that it takes interpretive cues from power dynamics, those of social inequality and relationality. A womanist reading is one that wants to expose and condemn oppression and violence in sacred contexts. And it does so because, according to Mitzi Smith, when we turn a blind eye to biases and violence in our sacred contexts, then the likelihood is great that we will learn how to internalize that oppression and that we will learn how to behave as oppressors. We will be traumatized people who will traumatize others. A womanist reading, then, is holistic, critical, and embodied. It is an invitation for healing. A womanist reading is scholarly, then, in that it is critical. It is not simply there to receive the story, but to push back against the story and to ask questions against the story. Those of you who have ever experienced godly play know the language of "I wonder." And a womanist response is always asking, I wonder who's missing. I wonder who didn't get to speak. And imagine what would happen when those voices could be brought to the table. So I wonder how we can employ our sanctified imaginations to learn from this story. Remember this notion that imagination is both synthetic and creative, that we draw from all of our experiences and recombine them in new ways so that we can come to new understandings of what is happening in this passage. Dinah comes into a family that has a history of living in tension. A tension between the promise of abundance that God made to Abraham and the lived reality of barrenness. Stay with me. Abraham is promised great descendants and a great nation and land and blessing, but his reality is very different. which means that his entire story is a story about the struggle between the promise of God and the reality of my life. Dinah's born into that family. Dinah's also born into a context and culture that is gendered and hierarchical. In fact, Dinah finds herself in a family and in a system that is a shame-honor culture. In a shame-honor culture, honor is something that can only be attained by men. And in order to attain this honor, they must assemble everything in their household and configure it in a particular way. They need to accumulate goods and status, and part of that status has to do with the women in their lives. In such a society, women are commodities that can be conduits or impediments to men's success. Women exist in the roles of wife and mother, daughter, and sexual object. And the woman or wife is clearly a possession, and the way she honors or dishonors her husband is tied to the way she manages her household, and it is connected to her sexual fidelity. In this world, there are only two kinds of women: the good ones, the ones who bring honor to their husbands, and the ones who do not. This ordered and hierarchical world depends on women and men occupying separate spheres, and the family structure is narrowly defined with men on the top and women in supporting roles. So in this world, daughters are burdens because their very existence creates opportunity for shame. This is so interesting because in the 21st century, you will hear men talk about their daughters with great worry. Oh, the sense in which somehow I must control, protect, contain her so that nothing bad happens to her, but not the same kind of anxiety around sons, all right? Women can be barren or disagreeable wives or unchaste daughters, or worse even yet, just unmarried. This worldview offers an image of women or a woman as morally, intellectually, and physically weaker than men, demanding constant oversight and supervision. Both women and men can bring shame, but only men can achieve this kind of honor. In some extra-biblical texts like Sirach, much of women's weakness is tied to their sexuality, and for that reason their sexuality must be controlled or feared at all costs. If we think now about the Dinah story and the offense that happens or the shame that comes to her father's house, there is enough evidence to confirm that the first offense to Dinah is not what happens with Shechem. So just take a moment and go back with me to the story of Dinah, because we see that Shechem sees, takes, lays with Dinah, and therefore humiliates her. We also find in that same passage that Jacob is now offended. Jacob's been hurt. Jacob has been damaged by what has happened to his daughter. And as soon as we see that, it helps us to realize the initial violence that happens to Dinah is that she is property. She belongs to Jacob. She is taken and given. She is bartered and bargained over, and she is the conveyor of pride or shame. She is Jacob's daughter and the object of Shechem's desire. She is sister to Simeon and Levi and the rest. And she is Leah's girl. But there is no autonomy for Dinah in the text that we know of. She does not speak for herself. The young men, Shechem, Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi speak, and their comments treat Dinah like an object. Her voice is absent. We don't know Dinah's perspective in any of these events, and so we're left at our own respective intersections, at our own locations, reading into the gaps of this story. And that is why there are so many different interpretations on what happened to Dinah. And in our own readings of this text, we find ourselves trying to possess her as well, so that we can use the story for our respective platforms. We cannot be absolutely sure what happens, and yet we have interpretations that say she is definitely raped, she is definitely not raped. And all of those conclusions are achieved without a word from the one person who can tell us what happened. That means that our readings are each in their own way selective. One reads through the lens of women, another reads through the lens of what matters for Jacob, and an intersectional and womanist reading is going to require that we acknowledge the complexity of both Dinah and everyone around her. Each character in this story occupies more than one space. And we need to find a way to make room for Dinah's voice, or else we will find ourselves both as oppressor and victim. Let me say a little bit more there. This story is complicated, and it alerts us to the problem of not hearing from her. Without her voice, we lay claim to her just like all the other interpreters. Some people will condemn her for going outside, out of the protection of her father's tents. Some of us will say she is a victim or survivor of rape. Some will say she is the one who brings shame to her father's house because she is lowered by her association with the Canaanite. Others will say she is the reason her brothers massacre the men of the land, bringing further shame on Jacob. This initial unpacking of Dinah's story teaches us some things about our sister Dinah. She is, in this narrative, an extension of Jacob. Whether she is raped or not, in these readings, this story is about Jacob. Dinah, daughter of Leah and Jacob, is a victim to the circumstances of her life, and she is a victim the second time to the storytellers who framed the story of Jacob to preserve the myth of racial purity. Remember, the ancestral stories, like all biblical stories, contribute to the communal identity of the people who preserve and propagate the traditions. Who's telling the story, and why are they telling the story? When we have Simeon and Levi, two men who go in and kill all the men, and then the rest of the brothers loot and pillage, we have to stop and say, how did two men go in and kill everybody? This is exaggerated violence, the kind of violence that we observe in the stories of people who feel powerless. They inform identity for the generations past and present. It would not be fitting for an ancestress to marry this outsider, and we cannot tolerate our great ancestor Jacob to be shamed in this way. All right? So long as Dinah is just a part of Jacob's story, she will always be compromised. Dinah learns, and her story teaches this lesson. Here we see that the stories of the ancestors are under the shadow of the storyteller's trauma. The need to establish, maintain, and preserve our particular identity is fueled in part by the community's own extended and significant suffering. These are people who have experienced the trauma of being a wilderness people, and then an exiled people, and then in diaspora. And so we can't tell the story of Jacob and all of his children without conveying our anguish and fear as a people who struggled to survive. And the trauma of this community is imprinted in their stories, just like trauma gets imprinted on our DNA. We have in the story of Dinah and in our current context, identity structures that rely on the subjugation of others in order to work. An intersectional reading of Dinah's story invites us to see levels of victimization that are instructive for our current context. To what extent does our drive to construct our communal identity require that we sacrifice some of our own along the way? And how does Israel's own experience as traumatized people inform the construction of their identity in their stories? Does the drive to construct an identity of ethnic and religious purity mean that Dinah must be sacrificed in much the same way that the construction of white superiority comes at the price of black humanity? Does the establishment of black masculinity have to come at the cost of black womanhood? How does the trauma inflicted on black sexuality make itself evident in African American communities? This dynamic is so palpable in many of our communities because we have not consistently engaged in recovery from the trauma of racism. I want to be clear here that survival and recovery are not the same thing. That in our own context, the violation of black sexuality has done its work in moving a people who have been told they were subhuman and inferior and animal-like, and as a result having their sexuality become a point of obsession for those who wanted to maintain superiority in the construct of the white race. Some of us come out of a place or a culture where white society needed to control black sexuality, controlling our bodies and our reproductive capacities so as to control them as a people. And if you can observe the dynamic that we see in the story of Jacob and Dinah, and observe the dynamic that we see when we think about white superiority and black oppression, that in both of these dynamics there is the controlling of bodies. When do we come to a point where we decide that it is not our business to control anybody's body? Men in the ancient Near East needed to control women's sexuality, meaning their bodies and reproductive capacities, so as to control them as a people. It was also necessary to impugn women's sexuality and to suggest that women were inferior beings. An intersectional reading of Dinah's story holds in tension the construct that seeks to control Dinah's sexuality as a woman and the construct of identity that needs to control Shechem's sexuality as an outsider, and the construct of identity that doesn't even acknowledge Dinah's sisters. All of this in the service to a construct of identity. Okay, the identity of the Israelite people comes from Abraham. God made Abraham a promise that he would be a great nation. And I'm not sure if Abraham was able to fully understand what God meant by the greatness of this nation, perhaps because he was formed in a context of barrenness. When fear threatens us, when change triggers us, we have to decide whether we are going to be shaped by hope or by scarcity. Whether we will follow our impulses to restrict or control, or whether we will lean into the impulse to be expansive and generous and make room. Which of these impulses will shape our family lives? The promise of God or culture? Will it be the promise of God, or will it be the restrictions of gender and sexual orientation and hierarchy? I would hope that we can use our sanctified imaginations to find our way to the fulfillment of God's promise that doesn't involve the decimation of others. I would hope that we could understand that the blessing of God does not have to be configured on the limitation or constricting of others. I would hope that we could imagine our way so that we could trust in God's abundance, and in so doing, be healed of the famine that is inside of us. How will we know when we're getting this right? This is really easy. If you want to know if you're getting community right, the prophets say, ask the least of these. Ask the women and the orphans and the widows. How do we need to know when we're getting these things right in our world? The answer is simple. Ask Dinah. Ask the people who never had a voice. Ask the people who get argued over, who never had an opportunity to speak. Ask those who don't have the rights to their own bodies. That's when we'll know when we're living into the promise of God.